Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is Professor Lawrence Mead, a contributor to the National Affairs and a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Hello, Professor Mead. How are you doing?
Good.
Yeah, so I'm really elated to speak to you. I'm expecting us to have an awesome conversation. So, Professor Mead, during the 90s, you became very famous for your welfare proposals. Give us some background.
Well, going back to my time in Washington in the 70s, I worked at a think tank where we did studies of federal welfare employment programs. And these programs were mostly ineffective because they were based on economic ideas that you just need to give people stronger incentives to work and they will work. That turned out to be false. When I got to NYU in the 80s, I did my own studies, which showed that the main determinant of whether welfare mothers worked was whether they were expected to work by the program. So what counted wasn't incentives, but rather authority. And on that basis and a more general reasoning, I made an argument for work requirements in welfare. We have such requirements at that time, but they weren't very effective or serious. And the argument that I made turned out to be influential, which surprised me. I did not expect to get a lot of support, but there was support, particularly from conservatives. And 1996, as you know, there was a major welfare reform in Washington in which the major aid program for families was changed to require work in a serious way for the first time. And that led to a sharp increase in the share of welfare mothers who were working, and also caused many of them simply to leave welfare entirely. And research showed that they emerged better off. Generally, this was a big success for the mothers and their children. Not everyone. There were a small number of mothers who left welfare without getting a job, and they're often called the detached mothers. And that was a criticism that we had more or less left them out in the cold. I think that's true. There was a need to do more for them, but this was a small group, and it didn't really affect the overall verdict in favor of reform. And since that time, there have been proposals to extend stronger work requirements to other welfare programs, especially what is now called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, otherwise known as food stamps. And those proposals, however, haven't gone anywhere because Congress has become more liberal in the meantime. And more recently, Congress, supported by the Biden administration, has essentially repealed welfare reform. Essentially, what they've done is given poor families a guaranteed income without work requirements, or indeed any requirements. And that is likely to mean a return to the rather unfortunate welfare system we had before 1996. So right now, my views are certainly in retreat. In the article that I think you read in National Affairs, I go through the politics of how this has happened, and also suggest that what we really need to do is to expand work programs for poor men, not just for welfare mothers, but for the men who are often the fathers of welfare families, but also have serious work problems. So that's not going anywhere right now, but that still is the correct analysis. That is, in fact, what we should be doing. So that's more or less my position. And I guess what's most surprising about it is that I didn't really have competition in making this argument. There were other experts who supported it, but none of them espoused it in the way that I did. And I continue to be surprised that this is still an unusual argument. In fact, it's the one that the public supports. Public opinion strongly favors work requirements, and indeed, welfare recipients themselves are in favor of work requirements. So it's not entirely clear why we don't do it with more conviction. So
Okay,
that's more or less the background.
all right. But I have another question. You said that some women did not benefit from the reforms. Did you do research to ascertain why?
The main reason is that they were not on welfare. Most of the fathers of welfare families have left the families and are living elsewhere, often on the street, often with other families. They are actually not on the benefit given to the mother and the child. And that's why they're outside the welfare system. Now, there are a few fathers who are still in the family, and it is possible for a welfare program to cover a family with two parents, but that's very unusual. It's not a major part of the caseload. So the fathers really are outside welfare, and yet they themselves have serious work problems. And as with the mothers, work incentives or benefits of any kind have not shown a capacity to get them to work more. So what we really have to do is make use of the child support system, which requires the fathers to contribute to the families. But this system is ineffective in getting the fathers to work. So my main recommendation is that we should build up a structure of required work programs for the fathers, much as we did for the mothers prior to welfare reform.
Y-
So that's, in fact, the main recommendation of my article.
yes, and it's also interesting that in your article you note that many of these work programs tend to focus on improving soft skills.
Yes, yes. And that's because that's the main impediment to people moving into employment. It isn't actually that they lack skills. To put it that way is rather too impersonal. What primarily is lacking is a capacity to take responsibility for having a job, to get up in the morning, to go to the workplace, to cooperate with your boss and with co-workers. And in other words, to um, see work as an obligation that you are required to fulfill. And that isn't the way most people in the policy community think of it. They think of employment simply as a benefit which government can give to people. Um, well, government can help, but to do a job must also be an obligation on the worker, and they have to accept that. And yet, that is something that's very hard for today's low-income population. They typically don't think of themselves as obligated to do anything. Rather, their lives are organized around survival, of doing whatever seems necessary every day to get through the day, to get income in some way, to solve other problems, to deal with children, to deal with health problems. And those pressures are the things they focus on rather than on pursuing their own goals. And that's what has to change. In order to hold a job, you have to accept that you now have an obligation. It's something that you have to do every day. And that's hard. That's actually harder than anything else about holding a job for this group.
Yes, and Professor Mead, your National Affairs, that publication has written articles on the role of social capital and the community in fostering development. People are likely to get employment because of networks, and researchers have found this for both upper class people and working people. However, we have seen in recent years that America is not is no longer a society built on trust and social capital. Trust seems to be declining, and welfare
Yes.
advocates often neglect the primacy of trust and social capital in reducing poverty. So, for example, Raj Shetty noted that communities characterized by marriage rates and social capital had lower levels of income inequality.
Yes. In fact, but to say that is only to rename the problem. That isn't really an explanation. It is actually poverty under another name. A feature of this gets into the argument I made in my recent book, Burdens of Freedom. The lacking, the thing that is lacking for many people who are low income is that they come from backgrounds in which we don't have a generalized trust of other people. That generalized trust turns out to be a feature primarily of mainstream culture, the culture that most Americans derive from Europe. And it's not found in the rest of the world. In most of humanity, you find trust limited to those people that someone knows directly and personally, like other family members, like people from your own locality, from your own group, whatever. Those are the people you trust, and you generally don't trust people outside that. Whereas in America and other Western countries going way back centuries, they developed an attitude, a civic attitude, that everyone was somehow the same as a citizen. And you should trust others to cooperate with you. So you could go into a shop and buy something and trust that you would not be defrauded or cheated in some way, because that simply wasn't done. And so it's possible for Americans to trust total strangers whom they don't know personally, yet those people are expected to behave well towards them. And that turns out to be very unusual. Now, that capacity is one of the things you need to do to get a job and hold a job. If you don't have people whom you can trust, then you're not likely to get the contacts to get a job. But trust has to be earned. The trouble with the idea of social capital is that most economists who talk about that think that it's something government give to people. No, it's based on a relationship that involves mutual trust, where both sides have earned the trust by the way they behave to other people. And you can't just give it to people. They have to earn it by being trustworthy. And that again assumes that you accept an obligation for someone else, that rather than your own immediate concerns. And that's hard. That is not normal. That is something that the West has achieved. And that is why it isn't really a solution. When we say someone lacks social capital, we're really saying by another name that they're poor, that they're isolated. And the main reality about poverty isn't actually lack of money. It's the fact that people are isolated, that they do not have the trust of other people. And the reason is that they themselves have not behaved in a trustworthy manner, usually going way back in their own lives. And that's why people won't help them. And you can't just give somebody that quality. They have to earn it by behaving in a trustworthy manner.
You're right, Professor Mead. So, for example, Africa is characterized by lower levels of trust and social capital. And when Africans migrate to America, they often do well academically. But in contrast to Caribbean citizens, they're less likely to form businesses due to their lower levels of trust.
Yes.
And what we often do not say is that trust, like other characteristics, can be inherited. It's partially
Inherited?
genetic.
Well, it might be. I'm not myself persuaded by genetic arguments about poverty. I don't see strong evidence that there's anything about the physical features of poor people that render them poor. Um, I don't find that argument persuasive, but I do find cultural arguments persuasive. The fact that Africa doesn't have a wide circle of social trust, that is not unique to Africa. You find the same thing in Asia. You find it in Latin America. It's only the West which has a wider sense of social trust, in which people routinely expect that they can trust other people whom they don't know and have never met. And those people assume that they will be treated decently. And that is, in fact, unique to the West. And it reflects a culture that is moralistic. Essentially, Westerners internalize norms of good behavior in their early lives, typically in the family. And that allows them to be trusting to other people later in life. And it's those civic qualities which they believe in, which allow them to behave in a constructive way with other people, even those they don't know. And the other people also have these same attitudes. So it's unusual to find that you can't trust a total stranger in, let us say, New York City. But people come from foreign countries, recent immigrants, they're more likely to be distrusting because that is the feature of their home society where they came from.
Exactly my point. And throughout our conversation, we'll talk about the family because many argue that the rise of the nuclear family has a positive impact on the formation of trust in the West. in the nuclear family, people were encouraged to marry outside of the in group and develop new relationships with strangers. So they had an incentive to trust. And usually during the medieval ages, servants were not directly related to the king group.
Uh, that's right. That's right. In fact, this is an argument made by Joe Hendrick in a recent book called the Weirdest People in the World," which is actually quite, he makes an argument quite similar to mine, that people from the West are unusual in seeking relationships outside the family. And I don't go by every aspect of Hendrick's argument, but the idea that the West is like that is correct. And the nuclear family can be seen as a kind of launching pad where people grow up initially in a family where they are taught the rules of good behavior, but it's assumed that they're going to leave home and go out and form other relationships with other people. In particular, they will typically marry somebody from a different family, and they will thereby become a member of a broader society in which trust is assumed. And that feature is the thing that allowed Western side societies, beginning in Europe and now in the United States, it allowed those societies to be enormously productive because the interactions people have with other people are almost entirely positive. They're about accomplishing tasks which you have set for yourself, and you cooperate with other people to do it, even though you don't know those people. We see that in de Tocqueville's image of America in the 1830s, where he already saw these features. But the reason was that all the people he met were from Europe. Almost all the immigrants who formed American society at that time all came from Scandinavia, from Britain, from Germany. They came from places where this ethos was already well established. This is not normal. This is not typical of the human race. And when what's happened recently since the 60s, most of our immigration has shifted away from the West and towards non-Western countries, particularly Asia and Latin America. And these societies are not trusting in the same way. They have to learn that once they get here. And there can be learning and adjustment. I think over time, the immigrants do become socialized to a more trusting attitude, but it takes several generations. This is not something that happens automatically. And it's not true when they first arrive. So they have to learn about good behavior. And that's necessary even in a society that thinks of itself as free. In fact, it's the inner um, acceptance of obligations of good behavior that makes freedom possible. It really isn't possible to have good behavior unless people have internalized the norms about that at a young age. And again, this is rare. This is not found in the rest of the world.
Yes, Professor. But what is also interesting is that non-Western groups with similar practices like the West are equally successful. So, for example, the Igbos relative to other groups in West
Yes.
Africa are more individualistic and egalitarian. Even in the
Yep.
pre-colonial era, they believed in impartial application of rules. And the Igbos, relative to other groups in Africa, are
Yeah.
likely to marry outside of the immediate tribe.
Yeah. I hadn't heard that, but I remember studying Nigeria when I was in graduate school. And what you say is true. The Igbos were, I believe, also more strongly influenced by foreign colonial powers who controlled those territories and promoted those attitudes. So, but although the Igbos would certainly be unusual for Africa, you see the same thing in India. There are a couple of groups within India, the Sikhs and the Garatis are within India, but they are also groups that have an attitude towards other people that is similar to what you find in the West, but they're small. They're not typical of India as a whole. So this trusting attitude is not universal, far from it.
Yes, and what we must say again is that individualistic countries, because of their capacity to trust, they're more likely to appropriate innovations from other countries. So again, the Igbos in Nigeria actually invited Asians to assist them as business partners in creating new enterprises. And I'm based on my own research, it is evident that benchmarking is a suitable strategy to grow an economy. Yet, yet on countless occasions, we have recognized that due to cultural barriers and other impediments, some groups are less willing to learn from cultures that are more advanced.
Um, That's right. And actually, the impediment isn't simply that there's a reluctance to change and accept advice of others. That's one way to put it. But actually, what you have is societies that are essentially static. They have formed ideas about the proper way things should be done, which are quite rigid. And the leadership groups in most traditional countries are set in their ways. They basically are running society the way it's always been run, and they don't allow innovation to occur in any important way. And the reason is not that they're against innovation per se, but it would threaten their own position. See, what's unique about the West, and this may be true in some parts of the non-West, but I really don't think it's typical. What you don't find is what in America, what we do, we allow innovation to occur, even though it's disruptive. And the leaders of the society accept that, and they don't attempt to stop it. On the contrary, they promote it. And those qualities have been evident in first Europe and now the offshoots of Europe since the 16th century, indeed before that. So there's this dynamism about the West that you don't find in the rest of the non-West because they're not willing to accept the turmoil that goes with innovation. I mean, America is swept continually by some innovation that changes our lives. Silicon Valley is just the most recent case, but there are a number of other technical innovations that began in America, and they were put together by entrepreneurs who didn't ask for anybody's permission. They just went and did it, and they transformed our lives. And we put up with that, and the leaders put up with that. And that isn't typical. Most leaders are very, very cautious about accepting economic development because it will perhaps threaten their position. And they don't think of themselves as serving the society. They think rather the society should be serving them and protect their position. And that, of course, is contrary to Western attitudes about government. We think government should be the servant of the society. And that isn't normal. In most societies, and Asia is a particular case of this, the rulers think that they deserve support from the societies automatically. That's particularly true in China. That's the assumption in China. And that means they're really not accountable for how they perform. This means society is static and it doesn't change. And China has become the great power that it is today, primarily because of great leadership, which decided to allow a greater market economy in China than was the case traditionally. But that's the only way that China got out of its lethargy. They weren't given to that. And even today, the growth of a market economy in China is a threat to the regime. And the leaders are struggling to maintain control of a society which is, in a sense, out of control. Whereas in America, we just assume society is out of control. We don't assume the government is supposed to govern society in that way. No, government is supposed to promote a productive economy that will make everybody richer. And that is an attitude not found in most of the world.
Yes, but Professor, during my research on the Asante Empire in West Africa, I
Yeah,
discovered that the Asante managed to appropriate some policies of Britain, but the issue at the time was that the Asante, unlike Western Europe, did not have a sustainable liberal revolution. This is my term. So
yeah,
throughout history, economic growth was not the norm, but every now and then a country experienced progress, but it was never maintained. The West had
yeah,
a sustainable revolution, and Joel Moncur
yeah,
writes on the Enlightenment, and he argues that the Enlightenment undermined rent seeking and pro conservative attitudes in relation to businesses. And this is unique to the West. Other countries had smart people, but they could not accommodate a sustainable
yeah,
liberal revolution because
yeah,
the West is innately disruptive, whereas in the rest of the world, people believe in conformity and stability.
yeah,
Stability
yeah.
is not valued in the West. Westerners like to be successful and prosperous, and prosperity and stability sometimes are a bit incongruous.
Yes, that's right. In fact, I remember the Ashanti had a traditional kingdom that was older than the rest of Nigeria, and they had some traditions of rule that were promising. And also the same thing happened in Uganda. Within Uganda, there's a country called a traditional kingdom called Uganda. and it too had a strong tradition of rule. But in both cases, as you say, they weren't really open to economic change because it would have meant threats to their position. And that is typical of the non-Western world. In order for there to be dynamism, a population has to have the features that you found in Europe. There has to be willingness to take responsibility for change at the lower level. Total strangers, people without background, can come up with some new idea, and they are allowed to proceed with it. And if it works, they'll get rich, and the whole society will get rich. And we tolerate that. But the only way we tolerate it is because alongside the dynamism, there also is these moral attitudes about good behavior, which allow there to be a civic culture. So although we have dynamism and even what looks like chaos, we still obey the law. We still pay our taxes. And therefore, government is able to govern. I mean, the paradox about the West is that although it has an individualist culture that appears to be very self-centered and can appear to be exploitative, no question about it, at the same time, this culture has developed the strongest governments the world has ever seen, far stronger than Asia, far stronger than the Soviet Union. Why? Because we have a civic culture and people behave as good citizens most of the time. And that allows government to develop extraordinary capacities. And we've seen that. We see it first in the British and then other European countries. And now in the US, we have an enormous regime which is able to do things on the other side of the world because of its enormous capacities. And that is true, even though, indeed, because that same regime is subject to constant criticism and accountability from the society. And whereas in the non-Western world, governments are much more conformist, they're not subject to constant question. You might think they're stronger, but they're not. They're weaker because they don't have the active consent of the people. And this means that they can't do very much. They can't collect revenue. They can't carry out big projects. They can't take any risks. I mean, the typical non-Western government is concerned only with staying in power. That's the only thing they were able to do. Whereas our system, because the regime is so strongly institutionalized, we can have a government that is accountable and which changes at regular intervals, as we saw in the recent election. And at the same time, a government that is able to do extraordinary things. And I think that is what is hard for the non-West to really accept, that a free country, because of its unusual psychology, is also able to be very, very strong. And that is really a paradox which we take for granted, and we really shouldn't. It's quite exceptional.
Yes. So, for example, when you compare Ghana to Nigeria, Ghana has managed to perform at a higher level because of its legacy of institutional exposure, but it's missing that ingredient that's quite important, individualism. So, for example,
Yep.
you noted that individualism is conflated with exploitation, but individualism is not a synonym for selfishness. When you're individualistic, you judge people based on their worth. You do not associate them with tribal or political identities. And
That's
this is one reason why individualistic countries are actually less corrupt,
yes.
because they lack generalized morality.
Yeah. See, that's because the civic culture strongly opposes corruption, private dealing, special deals, where you have some privilege that you get from government by paying somebody off. All of that is strongly opposed in the West. I don't mean that we totally avoid corruption. Obviously not. We do have corruption at a low level. But what we don't have is perhaps gains, as you see Mexico, to simply control the society. In Mexico, much of the country is not under the government's control. It's under the control of drug gangs who are more powerful than the government. And that's because the public is passive and it doesn't accept, or rather it's forced to accept, the rule of corruption because that is the only authority they have. And they see no way to challenge it. So they either pay the bribes or they try to go to America. And in America, they find a regime is very, very different, where you can't pay people off. You try to pay people off, you're going to get arrested for that. That's illegal. And we enforce that. So we have, and this goes back to the British. The British have very rigid views about obeying the law. And even though it's a free country, indeed, really the original free country, they have extremely strong attitudes about legal conformity. You obey the laws and you don't question it. And you can't challenge something by a devious manner. You have to obey the law, and you can challenge it publicly. You can criticize the government. That's allowed. Indeed, the government is accountable. However, you can't disobey the rules because you don't believe in them or because it's inconvenient. That's not allowed. So again, this is something that I end up saying over and over in my book. Basically, freedom isn't free. Freedom depends upon a series of civic attitudes that people have internalized, and usually at a very young age, that have caused them to be good citizens. And that is the precondition, really, of having a free society as we understand it.
Yes, and and again, Richard Nisbet in one of his books argued that Westerners are analytical, Asians are holistic in their thinking. But this is what
Yeah,
I really want to talk about. Singapore is a prosperous country, so is South Korea, so is Taiwan and Hong Kong.
yeah,
But when I read academics and business journals, writers often lament the levels of innovation in those societies. They argue that despite producing people who are exceptionally brilliant, they succumb to conventional thinking. So, for example,
yeah,
science, there's a relationship between science and innovation that's quite obvious. But in the West, someone can study philosophy and end up working at Silicon Valley. I find that
yeah,
Westerners are more likely to identify linkages across various professions.
yes. That's right. The Asians are very smart in the sense that they do well in IQ tests. But what they're not typically is innovative. They can't imagine a new way of looking at things. Now, one of the reasons for this, and I don't emphasize this in my public presentations, but in Burdens of Freedom, I note that a major difference between the West and the non-West is actually that the West is more theoretical. The West believes in theory, and we're ready to assign reality to some generalization that we find to be true, even though it isn't perfectly reflected in anything we can see around us. Whereas Asia is entirely empirical. Asians essentially assign reality only to the practical, to the things that they can see and hear and touch, and what works. Okay, that's important, and they can be very good at getting things to work. But what they're not able to do is imagine a new world, to imagine some new industry or some new product or some new idea that will change the world in some positive way. And that's what you find in Silicon Valley or in earlier technological developments. I mean, one of the most amazing stories in American history is the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics from Ohio. They had almost no background, yet they decided to solve the problem of flight. And within about 3 years, they had invented the airplane, and they solved all the major problems of controlling an airplane before anyone else. And they did this just because they decided to do it. And in that way, they changed the world. And again, Americans stand still for that. We allow the world to be changed by innovators like that. And that isn't what you find in really outside the West. You really don't find that. So you'll find technicians who are enormously talented. That's what you find in Japan in particular. You have great technology, but the fundamentally ideas behind what the Japanese do are coming from the West. That is where the new ideas arise. And because you have to have this inner belief in some theory, in some reality that you think is true. I mean, I did that in my own research in a minor way. I mean, basically, what I did in my own work on welfare work programs was find a new way to understand the work problem. And it was based upon hands-on contact with those programs, in which it turned out the economics of the program wasn't very important, whether people went to work. That's what all the previous research was about. But those people had never gone out and actually talked to people running those programs. When I did that, I found a very different reality, that in fact, what was crucial was public authority. They had to be told that they had to work now. And if you did tell them, then they would actually do it. And one of the reasons was that most of the recipients were coming from non-Western backgrounds, where there's this enormous deference to authority. In America, we obey authority when it's legitimate, but we don't defer to it. We assume we're running our own lives. Well, recipients typically are coming from a non-Western background. So they say, I do what authority expects me to do. And that's a way to get them to work. Now, in the end, that isn't really a solution. They have to decide to work for their own reasons. They have to be inner driven. And that means to move towards an individualist temperament where you take guidance from your internal goals, the things that you want to do. And that is beyond what most people on welfare can imagine. They're trying to survive, and they have to acquire a sense of control over their own lives before it's meaningful to say that they can really escape poverty. And I think that that's something that our best programs actually accomplish. We do move people towards the capacity to organize their own lives. That means they have to internalize these norms about good behavior. And once they've done that, then and only then can they truly be free and run their own lives.
Lawrence Mead, you are so nuanced, and I like the fact that you referred to the term theoretical. The concept of a theoretical culture emerged in the West according to Merlin Donald, and it is often said that at one point China was technologically superior to the West, and that's the
Yes,
problem. The
that is correct.
Chinese, the Chinese, according to Toby Huff in his book, did not have the concept of natural law. They had
Yeah,
technology, not science.
yes. Yeah, now China doesn't really think of reality as something theoretical at all. In fact, the conception in China is very much that what the government says, what originally the emperor said, was kind of like a natural law, that if the emperor told you to do something, you must do it in the same way as you can drop something from your hand and it will fall to the ground. The emperor's will is like a natural law that you take as binding on you, even though in fact it's simply an expression of authority. And the reason why China did not persist in the lead that it had in technological things was because it was too threatening to the regime. If you allow people to think about new solutions to technical problems, sooner or later they're going to become critical of the government, and that's something you can't imagine. If you're an emperor, you have to maintain order, and China, like most of the non-West, cannot combine freedom and order the way the West does. They have to have order first, even at the expense of free thinking and innovation and so on and so on. They really can't allow that, and we can. And that is the enormous advantage that the West has and has had for centuries. This is not new. The dynamism of the West and its civility are visible very early in the Dark Ages, even before the Middle Ages, and let alone the Renaissance and other later developments. You find this quality of free thinking combined with good attitudes about government. And so we have a society that generates good citizens who are also able to innovate and improve things. And they go ahead and do it. They don't ask for anybody's permission. Whereas in the Chinese case and other cases, the innovation that they allowed was always authorized from above. You had to have permission from the authorities to do virtually anything. In America, people just take it on themselves to solve a problem, and they often do. And that is why the society is so productive.
Yes, yes, and America is quite special because though Western Europeans are also individualistic, Americans place a stronger premium on individualism. So, for example, American parents encourage critical thinking and deep
Yeah,
analysis
yeah.
when compared to Asians and some Europeans.
Yes, your Asian education is mostly about rote learning. You learn what you're told by your professors, and you're expected to repeat it on tests and papers. That is simply the truth as you understand it. Whereas in Western thinking, that's true in the early stages. If we look at schools up through high school, there's a strong element of rote learning. You have to learn a lot of basic facts about your own society and about reality, science, et cetera, history. But after that, when we go to college, we expect people to begin to construct their own ideas. I mean, you've reasoned on the basis of what you know about Africa, about the nature of those societies, why it is that they do or do not have a capacity to change. See that there, you're bringing a fresh question to bear on something you've learned simply as a fact, and the facts can be used to support a more general argument about the nature of reality. See, and that it's that shift which is found really only in the West, because only there do people dare to say that there is a truth here that may not be apparent in some immediate facts. Or in my own research history, I encountered realities in the field typically, which were inconsistent with what people had said in previous research. So I was allowed to publish that, and I wasn't forced to conform to the dominant view at the time. And then events supported my views. So it doesn't mean that the game is over. On the contrary, people often ask me, whether my views are supported by other people, and I say, well, depends on what the studies say. I have to look at evaluation studies, and I read them because I want to find out if the evidence is supporting for my views, or it may be somebody else's views. So you can't just dictate a conclusion. You have to make an argument on the merits. And that is characteristic of Western science. Now, it can go too far. I think a problem of Western science, at least social science, the world that I know, is that it's become entirely too preoccupied with publishing in leading journals. And in order to get into the journals, students and also faculty have to focus on very narrow, very specific subjects, which they can analyze with some bulletproof method. But in so doing, they've lost substance. They really are no longer saying anything important. They are no longer making any general statement about reality. So they are, in fact, failing to reason in the way that science should do. In my books, typically I reason more broadly. I have a lot of evidence, some of it which I developed myself. I also read a lot of other people's works, and I put it all together in a picture of what's going on. And that's what you finally have to do if you want to understand what reality is. So the understanding finally proceeds from a theoretical grasp of the problem, which is based upon evidence, and you are accountable to that evidence. But finally, what you're interested in is to find out what is generally true. And that is the reflex of the Western academic mind, at least initially.
Yes, and Professor, furthermore, we are going to continue to discuss the West and the medieval ages to an extent, but only briefly. Based
Yeah.
on my reading of history, only the West was rejuvenated by foreign cultures. The Vikings conquered people and assimilated into their cultures when it was necessary. The barbarian kings were willing to learn from Christian scholars, and during the medieval ages, the scholastics were influenced by Muslims. The only exception outside of the West is Japan, and though Japan adopted Western technology, it remained Asian.
Yes. Japan is a remarkable case of a society which, as you say, remained Asian, is not at all individualist. And yet they had brilliant political gifts. They managed to solve the problem of government in a very precocious way, long before the rest of Asia. And more or less the way the British also led Europe in the Western world. The British experience in politics is such as to dazzle the mind. They put their government together in the most fundamental sense, almost from the foundation of the kingdom in the 9th century. And they therefore were way, way ahead of the rest of Europe. Now, I think you're right to say that other cultures had some influence on the West, but I wouldn't think it's fundamental. The really fundamental determinants of Western culture are, I would say, two things that really stand out. One of them is the Germanic tribes that formed Europe. The population that we now have in Europe came from mostly from Germanic tribes that invaded from the East, although not very far in the East, in the late Roman period, and then in the Dark Ages and the later ages. In those periods, the Germans bring in a more individualist culture than you had before, a culture of rivalry, a culture of individual distinction. And that gave Europe this dynastic quality where people are, even from the bottom, are seeking to prove themselves. And they have something to prove, and they're trying to get ahead in so doing, and they're allowed to do that. So the Germanic influence is very important. And the other major influence is biblical religion. Judaism and Christianity are actually the origins of most of what we now think of as Western culture. because in the Bible, you find an attitude that people have a calling, that they're supposed to do something. And that something comes from intimations about what God wants you to do. So the first thing that God ever says to Abraham in the book of Genesis is, leave your country and your kindred and your father's house and go to a country that I will show you. Now, right there, you have a distinctive note that became characteristic of the West. See, most people in the non-Western world, they never leave home. They stay with the families that they grow up in. They become more elderly and authoritative figures in those families, but they never really seek a new world. On the contrary, they have the world that they're given, and the given is all they're looking for. And in the Bible, on the contrary, individuals go in search of a new reality, which they will find, and which goes beyond anything they may have known before. And another distinctive feature is that the moralism of the West is rooted in inner-driven ideas about what's right and wrong. And we think of that as a constraint on freedom, but actually it empowers people who have an inner goal. That is what they go out and do. And here, the great story in Genesis, and I quote this in my book, in the 22nd chapter, God tempts Abraham by telling him to sacrifice Isaac, his beloved son. And he's about to do it. And then God intervenes and gives him an animal to sacrifice instead. And then an angel says to Abraham, because he has obeyed God's word, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And of course, that came about. And what Abraham, what he's doing there is showing the true nature of freedom, which is to pursue the inner goal. In this case, the goal of what God's will tells him to do. And that gives the Western cultures an immense power, which is not found in the non-West. And the energy that comes from that is ultimately what caused the West to dominate the world, according to several historians.
Yes.
So, but the burden of that is extraordinary. You have to be true to a vision that you have, and you pursue it over years. And that's true for many of the people that have transformed American society. They have long-term goals, which they have pursued over years, and they don't always succeed. I mean, some people will try to do something that they can't pull off, okay? But we honor them anyway for trying. And there are many other people who are trying things. And that it's that willingness to take a risk, basically to pursue your inner goal and change the world. That's what's typically lacking in the non-West. We don't find that. People, what they do much more is adjust to the outside world. They have pressures upon them coming from other people, from the government, from tradition, and so on. And they adjust to that, and they're very good at that. But that doesn't lead to change. And that's why most non-Western countries are relatively static. They're not going anywhere. Whereas the West has been going somewhere from the very beginning, from the Dark Ages. And I mean, the dynamism of Europe really doesn't end. I would say it's still there today, but not as strong as it used to be. Europe has become somewhat more complacent. But meanwhile, the dynamism is found in offshoots of Europe, like the United States and other former British colonies. In those countries, you find dynamism and innovation. And at the same time, strong government. That is the combination that I think is mysterious to the rest of the world. They don't understand how we can be so dynamic and accept so much change, and yet at the same time be well governed. I mean, that is really extraordinary. And it
Ex-
goes back to the psychology of the Western culture.
Excellent analysis. And another issue in the West is that the concept of God is reasonable and rational. He is not a capricious being.
Yes. Yes. Now here you get into to me, mysterious psychology. The theology of the Old Testament is about a God who is, in some sense, basically reasonable and who has a tie to individuals at a personal level. That's true. At the same time, God is in control, and God doesn't always do what you want. And if you read ancient Greek mythology, I'm thinking now of Homer's great works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. In those works, the individuals in the stories are fundamentally individualists. They're people who are seeking to distinguish themselves and be great leaders and to accomplish great deeds, and so on. And the gods are imagined as almost like them. The gods are like ethereal beings who sit up on a cloud and who intervene in human events in various ways. It's not rational. It's not coherent. It isn't really persuasive as an image of the theological world. The Jews have it much more accurately.
Yes. And
They
because,
somehow hit on the idea of God as a supremely powerful, but at the same time, rational. Yeah, and there's God also expects humans to use their reason to sort out reality. So God tolerates interventions and inquiries by human beings about the nature of reality, even though we never really can explain God's presence. The God is outside nature, outside society, and the ability to conceive that is um, unique to the Jews. They somehow hit on this. We find the same thing in Islam, but in Islam, there isn't the same trust in the individual that you find in the Western tradition. Islam remained always dependent, and still is today, dependent on external authority. And what you don't find, that you find in the West, is that authority migrates from outside to inside the self. And that image is actually present in the Bible. The number of passages in the Old and the New Testament where essentially God says, I will move my laws, the things, the 10 commandments and the other commandments of God, they move from outside to inside the self, and they become commitments that the individual has made to good behavior. And that is exactly what happens in Western culture. The moral commandments become inner laws of how one should behave. And that is unique to the West. In all the other traditions, the moral authority remains external, and it's outside forces that tell you what you should do. Whereas in the West, they are inside. And in fact, Weber's studies of religion convinced him that the beginning of Western culture actually is the Old Testament prophets, because they attack the authorities of their day in the name of higher principles, which they have internalized and which they receive directly from God. God tells them to go and say a certain thing. And often they don't want to be prophets, but they're told they must be. They've been called to be a prophet. So they go and they make these attacks on the authorities. And the authorities are still strong and they still have a right to govern, but they are accountable to the standards of the culture. And that is unique to the West. And Weber says that is the beginning of Western culture right there. And you don't find that. We think that's normal. Not at all. Not at all. Even in most of the world today, the authorities are deferred to. You don't find this willingness to question. Now, there are questions, but they're often coming from people who've been educated in the West. Oftentimes, the opinion leaders in third world countries are people who've been educated in Western countries, and they've taken on Western attitudes about accountability, and they go home, but they don't find the same support from the societies they came from, because in those societies, deference is overwhelming. And most people can't imagine really challenging the authorities. That's why those regimes remain weak, because they don't really have public support in the same way that you find in the West. So the one has to be amazed at the Jewish contribution to Western culture, and it's remarkable because for much of later Western history, that influence is taken over by Christianity, and the Jews re-enter our culture really only recently in the last several centuries, when they became great forces for innovation and thinking and philosophy in Western countries, and they remain powerfully creative today. But the formative influence is the one that counts. That is what generates Western culture more than anything else. And the more one thinks about it, the more amazing it is. It's hard to think that the world might have been without that. It could be that all we ever knew was the essentially external authority of whatever the powers that be are in a given country. That might be all we knew. And yet we don't. We somehow have this idea about generalized rights and wrongs, which we try to act on. And that's remarkable. It really is unusual.
yes. And furthermore, in the West, nature is not God. It is governed by natural laws created by God. This is quite
Yes.
obvious. However, when we're exploring science, we do not need to refer to God. So again,
Yeah.
Christianity gave the West an edge.
Yeah. That's true. And yet there's nothing science has found about creation or life that makes it any the less miraculous than it was in the Middle Ages. The the way in which life arose on the earth, and as far as we can know, only on the earth, um, is simply miraculous. There is no way to give a rational account of this at all. And scientists can trace what happened, but they can't really explain why it happened. And you can't independently create life in some new way. And we don't, I personally don't imagine that there is a form of life outside the earth. Um, it's all, as far as we know, right here. And that is something that we discover through science. The scientists, however, are deeply in awe of the things they find, and they should be. It is quite miraculous. And it is, in fact, quite, I've never understood why people see a conflict between scientific theories of evolution, let's say, and the account of creation given in the Bible. It's actually quite consistent. The story of the creation in the early chapters of Genesis is actually quite consistent with what scientists say about creation now.
Yes, and
Both sides are a miracle.
no, Professor, we're going to talk about that piece. You wrote it, it sparked controversy, poverty, and culture. But before you begin, I'm going to give my take. I wrote a
Okay.
piece for Mises.org on Black culture and individualism, and I argued that individualistic people are more innovative due to their ability to deviate from the norm. They're also more likely to take risk, and they're also
Yeah.
confident. And studies have actually corroborated my assumptions.
Yes.
Individualistic people are confident, they take more risk, and blacks are actually less individualistic than white
Yeah.
people, even middle class blacks. Wealthy blacks are also unlikely to invest in risky assets, and we have known for several decades that black people take less financial risk. But
Yeah.
some accused you of racism, and that's a dumb charge. I defended you in my piece.
Yeah. Uh, I'm interested in that. But for me, I mean, I'm sure it's true, as you say, that blacks are less likely to take risks of certain kinds. But to me, the more significant fact about Black America is that it's divided between a middle class, which has become individualist, and a larger body of mostly poor Blacks who have remained in a non-Western way of thinking and who are engaged still in a life of survival. The middle class Blacks are people just like you and me. They are overcommitted, overachievers trying to do things. And their lives are dominated by the obligations they've set for themselves rather than by anything external. I now have a number of Blacks, friends and associates who are quite remarkable in their own way of thinking. And they are, as I say, just like me, they're an overcommitted um, overachiever.
I'm black.
And yeah, and the fact that they're Black is incidental. I actually don't think of them as Black because their mentality is so much like mine. I have other friends who are non-white, and I don't. Race is simply not important alongside culture. That is the main, I guess, the main point of my book is that we should not focus on race per se. There's nothing magic about that. What is important is that groups that came originally from the non-Western world should assimilate to the individualist culture. And that's what Blacks have done, some Blacks. And they are the ones who have achieved the most. And it stands to reason they should, because it's that temperament that allows a person to take on board, to accept the burdens of your own life and your own goals. So you actually have to be obligated to be an individualist. And they are that way. And they often disagree with me. I have arguments with them. That's fine. They have different ideas. I expect that. What's much more disturbing to me is that the bulk of Black America remains in a passive mentality where they are reacting to outside pressures rather than pursuing their own goals. And that is what's unfortunate. And that is what condemns them really to be outside mainstream American life. And it also leads to the social disorders that we find among the group because they don't have the inner driven norms of good behavior that allow that keep them on the rails so they avoid trouble. See, this is what they should be, this is what children should be learning. And most children do learn in the family about how you're supposed to live in some very basic sense and how you avoid trouble. Then you go on and pursue your own life. And unfortunately, most of Black America isn't doing that. And we see this breakdown of the family, the disappearance of the fathers, dominance of single parent families. Kids from that background don't do very well in school. And it isn't because they can't learn, it's because they've grown up thinking that life is about survival and there isn't any point in pursuing a long-term goal. It's a tragedy. And this is the thing that we most have to change. The developments of social policy were headed in this direction until the recent liberal wave. And now we've given up on that. And the current Congress is willing to just throw money at social problems without really focusing on the real nature of the problem, which is about ways of life. And Blacks, also Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asians too. Surprisingly, many people think Asians have succeeded in America. And one point in my book is to say that that's much less true than we think. Asians also suffer from a struggle with coming to terms with individualism. They also have a hard time deciding what they want. And that's places a limit on what they can do in this country. So, but the Black case is the most important. That's where we have the most serious poverty and also where Blacks make the strongest claims that all their problems are due to white people. And that is what, of course, the recent anti-racism movement has said. And that's, I think, is a complete red herring. I'm not denying that there is racism in this country, but it's vastly less important than the cultural difference between Blacks as a group and the mainstream culture. That is the really serious problem. And the podcast that I'm now developing under the title Poverty and Culture is all about that. What I end up doing is talking about cultural difference with a number of other people. And we reason about it and think about how we can understand it more deeply. That is the real frontier. That is what we
Yes.
have to work about.
No, Professor, I'm glad you referred to Asians. According to one study reported by the Harvard Business Review, Asians
Yes,
are least likely to be promoted to senior
yes,
management positions. And then Richard Nisbet did a study arguing that
yes,
some Asians,
yes,
because of their personality, are unlikely to succeed in corporate America. They may be employed in a
yeah,
prestigious job, but they do not
yeah,
rise beyond a certain level.
yeah,
And another point
yeah,
again is that Black culture is conformist. So I have a piece on the topic for Chronicles magazine, and I argue that conformity is limiting the progress of Black Americans. So in
yeah,
white
yeah,
Western society, the eccentric is celebrated, not so in Black America. There are still people in Black America who assume that if you read comic books, you're weird and white. And that,
yeah,
that, that came as a surprise to me. But
yeah.
conformity is a
Well,
big
yeah,
problem.
yeah. But the conformity is a general feature of the non-West. It's not unique to
Unique to
Blacks
Blacks,
or
yeah.
unique to Africa. The conformity follows from a culture in which people defer to authority and they expect to be told what to think and so on and so on. And that is the way most of the world thinks of society. It is a structure of conformity where the goal is to satisfy the authorities and therefore stay out of trouble and live a peaceful life, but nothing changes. And what's unique about the West is that it somehow has hit on a formula where we can also be innovative and yet at the same time maintain order. And that's hard. I think the writing Burdens of Freedom made me aware more than I think I was before of how tough it is for Blacks to assimilate to this culture because they're coming from such a strange place. They're coming from a world that is completely conformist. Now, and in the Black case, it isn't just that they came here as slaves from Africa. They also lived through slavery and Jim Crow, which maintained a culture of conformity with top-down authority. And it's only after that, only when Blacks leave the South and go to the cities of the North, that they really have to grapple with an individualist culture. And there, I would estimate something like a third of the group has been able to adjust and has actually become substantially individualistic. But the other 2/3 are still engaging in survival. And that is the thing that has to change. There has to be greater willingness on their part to take on the burdens of freedom. And then from that follows a much realer freedom than they could ever have otherwise. And the leaders, the irony is that the leaders of the anti-racism movement are themselves actually very effective individualists. They show a temperament that is assertive and is individualist. It's what they're saying is wrong. What they're saying is, in fact, profoundly deceptive and even destructive. But their manner is exemplary. And I think what they ought to say to their followers is, don't do what we say, rather do what we are. Be like us, assert yourself. I mean,
Yes.
I hit on a site in the book. He said that after civil rights, the main challenge faced by Blacks is to develop what he calls assertive individualism, assertive temperament. That is what they have to have. And that's exactly right. They have to be more assertive. There's nothing in what I'm saying that argues for conformity, quite the contrary.
All
But
right.
it does argue for good behavior.
Yes. So, Professor Mead, Professor,
Yeah.
we have been having an exciting discussion, but unfortunately, I have to wrap up. It was a pleasure to
Okay.
speak to you.
Well, I think I've had my say, and I'm interested in what you've had to say about Africa. Obviously, you put some effort into figuring out Africa, and that is all to the good.
Yeah. So,
So,
you have a podcast at some time. I may just pop up.
okay, that's something I might pursue,
Uh,
and that would be interesting.
all right. Thanks. All right. Bye.
Okay, all right. Good to talk to you, and I'm sure we'll meet again.
All right.